Haidong! In this video, we're going to introduce the idea of the focuses. Out of context, that sounds really weird, right? Because I used focuses as a plural. But if you're not familiar with it, so the focuses are a set of drills that are generally associated per a belt in the Federation forms. So for example, stance focus number 1 is associated with the Form 1. So for example, as you're testing from Form 1 to Form 2, you would also do stance focus number 1 as part of your test. This is not to be confused from focusing at the end of a form. So for example, if we just finished Form 2, for example, if we clear, grab, defense. So this is also called a focus. But this is more like honing your will at the end of a form before you actually put your sword away. So don't confuse those two, just because we use the word focus to cover a lot of different things. So when we talk about focus, think about the jipjong, which is the Korean word for it. So for example, Baegi jipjong is going to be the cutting focus. This video is going to be broken down primarily into two different parts, right? So the first part is just why does it exist, right? So why does it exist from a curriculum perspective? Why does it exist from a testing perspective? Why does it exist from an application perspective? At the very end, I'm also going to talk about my own interpretation of how to use the focuses during your classes. Let's talk about like why they exist. One of the boring answers is it gives the student a little bit more to work on. So as of right now, so the main parts of a Gumdo curriculum are primarily, again, like forms, right? So because forms is the main bread and butter of most of our classes. We sometimes have the kyakum if they're first degree. We have the skills drills, right? So like throw cutting, paper cutting, all that fun stuff, as well as a couple other things here and there. But if you add the focuses, it's going to give you an extra dimension that you can focus on per belt. So for example, you can focus on your stances during Form 1 because Form 1 just really has 3 stances, right? So kimase, teidose, and walking stance. Technically, you can kind of say there's a little bit different near the end, but it gives the student more to work on than just the form. A slightly less boring but a little bit more obvious aspect is it teaches you a certain aspect to focus on. So for example, going through a cutting focus is going to make you more aware of aspects of cutting, stance focus, aspects of stances, and all that, that obvious stuff. So for example, if you notice your student is lacking, at least in the hip placement of the stances, right? So maybe they're doing something kind of like this in their teidose, you can notice like, all right, so remember the stance focus, right? So if we're here, right, so feel your hip, you're going to shift it back. Feel how your stances are moving with regard to your hips, right? So if you notice your student doing something, you'd be like, all right, so remember stance focus that you did for example, when you were a white belt or something like that. Remember that? Let's go back through that so that you can, again, remember aspects of, again, hip placement, where the center of mass is and all that, useful stuff that's going to transition to more than just that focus. As of right now, at least as far as I know in North America, there are 5 major focuses. So we have stances, so stance focus, cutting focus, thrusting focus, attack focus, and defense focus. The attack focus is also split up into reverse and blocking focus. I kind of keep them all the same just because it's about the same. There are other drills out there like the 10 count and the 25 count that technically aren't focuses, but they are things that you might want to know as, first of all, as an instructor and as someone who might be testing with this. One thing to keep in mind though is as you test for first degree, for example, you're expected to know all of the focuses associated with the color belts. So for example, you need to know stance focus 1 through 3, you need to know cutting focus 1 through 3, and you need to know defense focus 1 and 2. So that adds up to 8, right? So there's 1 per belt. So in general, if you learn something throughout the color belt, you're expected to know it when you test for a black belt. So that's particularly why the senior red or when you learn Form 8, whichever belt you associate with, or the red black belt is another one I've seen, those belts tend to be the longest because you also have to remember all the other things that you tested with in the past. These focuses tend to be a point of contention a little bit just because sometimes it was taught a little bit differently from region to region. Ideally in the future we really kind of like cement all of it into one known way, but for now keep in mind that other schools might do it a little bit differently, but again, do it the best way that you know. I'm going to go through aspects of each of the focuses in a future video, or videos, right? But for now, just keep in mind, each of the focuses do have a specific point they're trying to teach. So obviously there's the boring answer of, yeah, the cutting focus is trying to teach you how to cut. Meh, right? So for example, cutting focus number 1 focuses on the transition of cuts among other things. Versus number 2 is going to be focusing more on core work. So now for the non-canonical portion of the video, because there usually is one per video. So this is my own interpretation of the focuses. This is going to be a little bit different from what the Federation is doing. So for example, I still test my students the way it is parceled out according to the Federation, but I also do teach things at different order as according to, again, what suits me. So this is what I do for my students. The way I've conceptualized the purpose of the focuses is primarily for white and yellow belts. That might seem weird because I have a second degree who is doing stance focus number 4, 5, and 6, for example. So that it seems weird that I would conceptualize the idea of the focuses according to like just white and yellow belts, but this is my rationale for it. I like to use the focuses as a drill that they can do actually at home if they want to. Right, because a lot of them don't take up that much space. Defense focus number 2 does, because you're just walking with the stances. But for example, like if you have like limited ceiling height, for example, you can still do the defense focus, right? So you can be here and just like, again, go through your defenses. And it also helps you run through ideas, right? So for example, if I like to work on sparring and I tend to already use these 2 blocks a lot, maybe I don't use the pushing pow sensei that often, as I cycle through the defenses and like, all right, what don't I use? Oh, I don't really use this defense that much. Let me try that in combat and kind of see like what are the benefits of it and all that fun stuff. So focuses are a great way for you to remember curriculum, and it's also a good way for you just to grind through the basics, right? So for example, because I have some issue with my hamstrings and my lower back and all that fun stuff, I like to go through the stance focus on my own, almost as a stretching exercise, right? So like, all right, so I might be in kimase, at home, right? So that's hopefully a better kimase than I'm used to. So if I'm in kimase, right, so I can feel my core tightening, my glutes, my thigh, my lower back, all that activating. I tend to do this open-handed, but you can obviously do that as intended with a cut. But from here, I might shift, bomse. Again, feel that hip sink back, feel this stretch out, and obviously I'm stretching out the hamstring as I do it. But I'm also thinking about all sorts of other aspects, right? So I'm focusing on my center of mass. I'm focusing on how my hips are placed. I'm focusing on, again, how my body is reacting to my weight. So for example, if I have my foot slightly more outward, so don't do this, more outward, what happens? Like, oh, I feel it more in my knee and feel it twisting. Okay, what if I have almost forward? Okay, I don't feel it in a certain position here. So you can kind of like feel yourself getting a little bit better just by holding this stance. So the focuses are a good way for you to like so cherry pick certain aspects that you want to work on. Ideally, like I like to use them at home more than anything else, but that's at least one way you can use them. Another reason I like to do this early on is that there are concepts in the focuses I want to introduce as early as possible. So for example, with the thrusting focus, I want you to be able to stab. The first stab, the official stab, I believe, is in 5, because, right, so over here we do like the double step stab. There used to be a stab in the old ways at the end of 4, where you do a nice stab here, but that has since changed, so don't do that. Is now just a fancy focus. But if you're fighting someone, stab them, right? So if we're here, right, so they haven't, stabbed anything in the past before, this is just a nice way to work on how your body engages with a sword when you want to puncture someone. And then, if you get used to the general motion of where the stabs go, we can start moving with it, which is obviously 4, 5, and 6. So, 2 and 3. Right? 4, 5, and 6 is just for stances and cutting, because it gets complicated. So for example, if we're sparring, I want to get used to moving as you stab, right? Well, golly, that's stance focus number 2. There we go. That's stance focus number 2. I'm just going off to the side, thrusting, going off to the side, thrusting, right? So that's going to be very useful to even a white belt who wants to start, engaging with students who are stabbing them. Like, oh, how do I learn how to not get stabbed? I can deflect and stab them from the side. So again, moving on angles. So that's again another reason I like to teach this stuff pretty early on. And one more reason I like to do it early on is that the order that they teach it is not always for me at least, so again this is personal opinion, not necessarily the best order for the students associated with those belt ranks. So for example, my student who is going for 3rd degree doing stance focus 4, 5, and 6, how much more is that helping, I'm going to say him or her because I'm not going to give anything away, how is that helping him or her any more than just going through their form, right? So at 2nd grade, you've been training for a very long time, you've been training for years and years and years. How helpful is it now you're now suddenly learning to do this, right? Like it doesn't quite add up to me. So that's yet another reason I like to do all the focuses early on. So again, it gives the white or yellow belt a lot of material for them to contemplate. And once they know the drill, later on, right, so if they are, again, lacking in stances, I can be like, all right, remember the stance focus that you learned way back when? Okay, first let's review it. Now that you remember it, go through it with the idea of making your stances longer, or with the idea of, you're more centered, or with the idea of your hips more back, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you know what the focuses are doing, you can alter them to your individual student. So in that case, I think earlier is better. Drills. So what I'd like for you to focus on the focuses, is 3 individual points that each of those focuses is trying to teach you. So obviously I'm going to be doing this in future videos, but focus on all right, so let me think about stance focus number 1. What are 3 things that it's trying to teach me that I can't just do in the form? Now obviously you can do all these in the form, but what is it trying to specialize in that seems to be different from if I just try to do this through a form? Another drill is actually learn the Korean for all of these. I know a few of the Koreans, right? So Begi Jipjong, so pretty much if it ends with Jipjong is one of our focuses, but learn the Korean for it, right? Because that will be very, very useful for when you do go to a Federation test and they don't tell you, oh, go through stance focus number 1. Okay, or cutting focus number 1 because I actually know the word for cutting focus. Oh, I want you to go through cutting focus number 1. They're going to say, oh, Begi Jipjong Yilban. You're like, okay, sure, and you might do the wrong thing, you're going to look silly, you won't be happy. So I would recommend that you start learning the Korean for that, as well as all the other terminology, but since you just watched this video, keep those guys in mind. But as always, keep training, stay humble, and stay safe. Haidong.